is my first presentation in front of a big audience, so pardon me if I get nervous. You know what was my biggest fear today about this presentation? That I may have to go to restroom in the middle of it, and then people are gonna just leave. This is a topic that I have thought about for a long time, and I kept thinking, why isn't there a presentation on it? And I kept thinking, and I kept talking to my friends, and then somebody said, well, if there isn't a presentation, why don't you do it? So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try, and it has been a scary experience preparing for it. I haven't slept properly. So once it's done, I'm just gonna go back to my hotel room and sleep. All right, so let's get started. For many years, I was lost as a software developer. I used to think that I wasn't smart enough to be a developer. On most teams, I got to work on big ball of mud. And I didn't know that's what it was called. I was afraid to ask questions because I thought it would make me look dumb. I blamed myself for not being able to understand the bad code. And I blamed myself for not being able to navigate through it easily. And this experience is really close to my heart because I used to have nightmares in those days. And I used to think about leaving software development. So it became really frustrating, and came a point where I thought I had to do something about it. So I browsed through internet, and I started looking for the best resources to learn software development. And I came across Pluralsight, and I went through any course I could find on ASP.NET. I'm a .NET developer, and I don't like calling when you developers say I'm a .NET developer or Java developer, because when you're a developer, you're just a developer. So I looked up, and I went through a lot of courses on ASP.NET, Angular, jQuery, or any other buzzwords I found or heard around that time. To my surprise, I was still struggling at navigating through the bad code. I got lucky one day. I ended up on a good team that focused on good design practices. You can't believe how happy I was when I looked at the code and I could understand it easily without any struggle. I knew now it wasn't me, it was the code. A light bulb turned on. I made a list of good design books, and I've gone through many of them. I don't know why Eric's book ended up towards the far end of that list, but I eventually read it. Domain-driven design is unique. All the design books that I read focused on design for developers and its value for developers. Domain-driven design brought the domain experts to the center of the design, right alongside the developers. Domain-driven design is also unique for its focus on strategic design. It helped me connect the agile process with the software design practices. So today I wanted to talk about the close relationship between domain-driven design and agile software development process. I also wanted to focus on the fundamentals of software design, since both domain-driven design and agile software development rely on them. Domain-driven design is an approach to building software for complex business needs by deeply connecting the implementation to an evolving model of the core business concepts. In simple words, it's about building software that correctly models your business needs by making the implementation adaptable to change. The second principle from Agile Manifesto says, welcome changing requirements, even late in development. I wanted to also focus on another important concept from domain-driven design before we move further. Ubiquitous language. It is terminology about the domain shared by all the parties involved in the product development. It's not only used in the discussions of requirements, it's also used in discussing design. And it's reflected all the way in the product source code. The idea that reflects the same concept from the clean code practices is intention revealing code. Clean code says each class, method, variable should be named so carefully that the story they tell is the story of the business you are writing. I wanted to share an experience with you. I was working as a software design engineer in Chest, and I was part of an agile team. My team was building testing framework for a content management system. Link, linear integrated query, was recently released, and I used it heavily because it was cool and I wanted to learn it. When I submitted the code review request, my manager told me, if it's not simple, it's not right. Now you would be wondering, why is a manager reviewing the code? But the company I worked at, everybody was hands-on. Managers were involved in development. No wonder he made that comment, because I use link expressions to write for loops. He told me to rewrite pretty much the whole implementation and keep it simple. It was a big lesson for me, and it has taken me years to learn to think simple, and I'm still learning it. The key takeaway from that story is that simplicity is important for good design. You have to think simple in your mind first before you can write simple code. I'm sure you all have knowledge of domain-driven design, agile process, and software design. So pardon me if you feel like I'm taking you back to those fundamentals. We often ignore the fundamentals and get attracted towards the complicated ideas, and that leads to problems. I was talking to a friend once about how to understand code, and I was telling him about this brown bag I presented on clean code techniques. An architect who was attending the presentation made this comment. He really made this comment. He said, I can understand any code pretty quickly. Doesn't matter how badly it is written. And I wonder if he meant that people who find it hard to understand the bad code aren't as smart. And that's how I used to feel about myself when I couldn't understand the bad code. But the truth is, you are not dumb, it's the code. My friend said, I have worked for decades as a developer, and I have delivered many successful products. So if I find it hard to understand the code, it must have been written badly. Eric's book talks a lot about anemic models. So let's see what anemic model is. It's an anti-pattern. Martin Fowler says, the fundamental horror of this anti-pattern is that it's so contrary to the idea of object-oriented design. And what's worse is that people think anemic objects are real objects, thus completely missing the point of what object-oriented design is all about. Most of us have studied object-oriented design and books on software engineering, but we still end up writing bad code. Do you know or remember the definition of encapsulation? I ask it a lot in the interviews, and more than often, it's not exactly the intent of what encapsulation is about. Encapsulation describes the idea of bundling the data and the process that works on that data together in one unit. If you look at this picture, the two objects in the top, they are anemic models. You can see that the data is separate and the process that's going to work on that data is separate. The one on the right, and don't take it by the word, it's service. It's not a web service. It's just representing any object. The process and data is separated. This is clear representation of anemic models. And the one below uses encapsulation. It's not an anemic object. DDD's rule of thumb is bind data and process together in models and set clear boundaries around the models to keep them apart. Keep them in context. We all know about bounded context. Eric says that there are process books and then there are design books, and they seldom reference each other. He says that his book is a design book, but he believes that the design and the process are impossible to separate. And really, that is the point that I'm trying to make with this presentation today. Domain-driven design is oriented towards the family of the agile software development. Domain-driven design is for teams that are already applying agile software development process. DDD assumes that there are certain practices already in place, such as the development is iterative, and the business and developers have a close working relationship. I want to share about the first project that I came across that applied domain-driven design. You will notice the anti-patterns and the bad practices in this project that led to the failure of both domain-driven design and agile development process. I was part of a big team, and all I heard the leads and the architects talk about was entities, aggregates, aggregate truth, value objects, and so on. And that's all I noticed in the code too. The developers weren't part of the design discussions. And they didn't get any direction from the leads and the architects on design, but they were the ones writing the code. I saw a lot of problems in the code. There was no focus on the code quality. There was no concept of adaptable design. There were no unit tests. And it was surprising that people hadn't heard about solid principles. Object-oriented programming just meant that there should be classes. How is it possible that a team that was trying so hard to apply domain-driven design had really bad implementation of the code? The team also claimed to be an agile team that ran 2-week-long sprints. The business analyst never showed up in the sprint planning meetings, which would have been okay if there were any other domain experts present to share the business requirements. The user stories were written by the leads and the architects. The user stories looked something like this. In class A, from method A, call method B of class B. So I was really surprised. Now you must be thinking, that sounds more like a sequence diagram written in the paragraph. Normally there were 3 stories, sometimes 4, to finish one end-to-end interaction with the system. And I call it an interaction because even after finishing those 3 or 4 user stories, you couldn't get a usable feature. There was one story for the UI, there was one story for the backend, and one for the database, and one for any other component in the application. This reminds me of Conway's law. Conway's law says organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs that are copies of the communication structure of that organization. Did you hear that the stories were assigned to the developers? 11th principle from Agile Manifesto says, the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. The lead assigned the stories to the developers. And when I asked, why not let the developers pick the user stories on their own, the answer was, who will be accountable then? They won't pick the stories on their own. There was no trust in the team. 5th principle says, build projects around motivated individuals and give them resources and environment to get their job done. Another thing that I noticed, the stories were estimated before they came to the sprint planning meeting. The lead and the architects estimated the stories, and they got assigned to the same developer who worked in that area before. And this led to presence of certain team members indispensable. There was no knowledge sharing. Sorry. Who really had the domain knowledge? The business analyst did, and the lead and the architects also had the domain knowledge because they attended the backlog grooming meetings with the business analyst. But they never communicated that knowledge to the developers. The developers only heard about the need to create a view model, a message, a table, and so on. I tried to convince that if the requirements are being discussed in the backlog grooming meetings, the developers should be part of that meeting. Unfortunately, the developers didn't show any interest in attending that meeting. They had no association with the vision of the product. They didn't value the domain knowledge much. To the developers, they thought that their job was to deliver code, not to deliver business value. This team was failing at design and process both terribly. Now, this team took on all the terms from domain-driven design and the complicated implementation ideas and technologies such as actor model, service fabric, microservices, messaging, distributed design, and tried to apply it without focusing on the fundamentals of software design and the values behind the agile process. We software developers are often guilty of taking on extra complexity to learn and to make our resumes look good at the cost of the failure of the product. We talked about Agile so much. Now let's go and see what Agile Alliance says about it. Agile is the ability to move quickly and easily. Agile Alliance says it is a mindset informed by the Agile Manifesto and the 12 principles from the Agile Manifesto. Another synonym for agile is supple and adaptable. Eric talks about supple design in his book in chapter 10. He says that the ultimate purpose of a software is to serve the user first, but the same software must serve the must serve the developers. If the software with complex behavior lacks good design, it becomes hard to refactor. It becomes rigid, thus hindering the ability to respond to change. In my experience, I have seen more teams get affected negatively by the agile process than those being helped. We become servant to the process instead of the process serving us. I don't remember where I heard that, but I really like that sentence. Now, I had this experience recently. I was sitting in the sprint planning meeting, and we started talking about the user stories we were going to work on. The first user story was about the user login to the application. And this is how the user story was written. Now, if you see, it has who, what, and why. It follows the perfect format of a user story, but it serves no value to the user. We stopped the sprint planning meeting and realized that we have a lot to learn first to create requirements that provide value to the user. And I am fortunate right now that I work in a team where manager is very supportive of learning. So I'm able to spend time with the BAs to go through the process of really learning how to think like a user and how to create good user stories. I have seen teams where Scrum Masters and BAs tell the developers whether they can focus on the design or not, and whether they should spend time on writing unit tests or not. It happened to me personally, and in more than one project. In one project, the Scrum Master told me to not waste time on writing unit tests. And in another, my manager told me to This makes me laugh, sorry. So he told me to not waste time on automating the deployment process. He said, everybody has been doing it manually in this company. Why do you have to automate it? Sorry. He took me to his manager to complain about it. Agile has gotten some bad reputation over time, and I'll share why. But there's a hint in the examples I gave. Did anybody notice the word Scrum Master? And I have nothing against Scrum Masters. Kent had a vision to heal the divide between the developers and the business. He wanted to build a process that was designed and controlled by developers for the developers and the business. He wanted to create a process that focused on code quality. Ninth principle from Agile Manifesto that says, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. He wanted to create a process that focused on business. Fourth principle from Agile Manifesto. Developers and business must work together throughout the project. And he wanted to build a process that fostered communication. Sixth principle from Agile Manifesto. The best method of communication for conveying information in the team is by face-to-face communication. Then Ken Schwaber came with the idea of Scrum, and he created the Scrum Master certifications. Guess who came to take the certification courses? It wasn't the developers. It was the project managers, and also people who didn't want to be developers anymore. It is frustrating to be a developer. I have thought about it many times when I've taken the certification course. Scrum and frameworks like Scrum do help you to put a structure and helps you organize better. Scrum Alliance says that Scrum relies on cross-functional teams to deliver products and services in short time frames. These two words, short time frames, have really affected design badly. It has been taken literally. It ignores the focus on design. Scrum worsened the divide between the developers and the business. I wanted to share another experience. And the reason I'm sharing more than experiences on both bad sides and good sides, so that you can see that there's a pattern on these both sides. I joined an organization as a consultant, and my manager asked me to help this one team that was really struggling to deliver value. I noticed multiple fundamental problems, and they're kind of same problems, maybe a little different. The code quality was really bad. The design was bad. There were no unit tests. There was no test automation, and there were no automated deployments. As the application grew, it became really hard to add more features or to make any changes in the application. As the application grew, it became hard to deploy the application since the number of components grew. There were tons of bugs popping up. The business analysts and the Scrum Master pressured the developers to deliver value, while at the same time blaming them for a lot of bugs. Developers were told to not waste time on refactoring, design, test automation, or automating the deployment. I have personally experienced these many times. I'm sure many of you have too. For BAs, all the features asked by the stakeholders were required. They had completely missed the idea behind, I think it's the 10th principle from Agile Manifesto. Simplicity, the art of maximizing the work not done, is essential. Another issue was that the developers had no association with the vision of the product. See, a lot of things are repeating here. They didn't understand the domain well. The BAs wrote stories in a vague manner and didn't spend enough time with the developers to answer their questions. I would love to say that the developers should have just raised their hands and asked for the resources and environment to create good products. But some didn't know better, and some need their jobs. It's all not bad though. I have been on good teams, and I have learned a lot from them. I was working at this financial company. The IT in this company was mostly following waterfall process of development. The team I was part of had some advantages. The manager was very supportive, and the tech lead really believed in good design practices and the continuous delivery of value to the business. This is the same team where I got lucky. We were mostly maintaining and supporting the legacy applications, but we used to spend a lot of time refactoring. Our team was awarded the development of a new product for asset management. I, my tech lead, and Jason, who's also sitting here, were the developers in this team. We had an amazing business analyst. He knew the domain in and out. Justin. We were going to be the first team to follow the agile development process in this company. I was the novice in both areas, design and process. My tech lead was really good with design, and Jason was really good with process. Jason suggested that we spend 2 hours a week grooming the requirements with the BA. I wasn't very happy about that idea. I didn't want to spend 2 hours learning about the requirements. But I did. And slowly I started seeing the value. I learned a lot about the domain, and I started enjoying the development process. I knew the value that I was going to deliver to the business. Our BA sat amongst us, right nearby us, and we could ask him any questions anytime. We not only spent time in grooming the requirements in those meetings, we thought about the roadblocks or issues that we could face, and we could work on those in advance before we got there. Our BA trusted our estimates and never forced us to deliver more than we could. We focused on good design. We focused on adaptable architecture. We wrote a lot of unit tests, integration tests, system tests that added a lot of value. Our BA could take a look anytime at the development environment and see the progress that we were making and provide feedback. We never had to spend time on regression testing, since we had invested heavily in the test automations. Thanks, Jason. We invested in automating the deployment right from the beginning, so deploying was a breeze. I wanted to share another story, a good story. I worked at a company that has been instrumental in the Agile movement. I heard a lot of people say that whatever the books say about good design and Agile process, not everything works in real life. I had the first-hand experience working at this company that the practices didn't come from the books came from the practices. In this team I worked on, the day started with a quick daily stand-up. And right after the stand-up, people picked their development pairs. We did pair programming. And they also picked the roadblocks or issues they were going to follow up and resolve that day. If there was any need of any design discussion, the team got together quickly for a tech huddle. The team worked throughout the day, the pairs worked throughout the day together and had constant discussions on design. And there was another advantage. There was constant code review going on since there were pairs. There was a rule for the team. If you were blocked for more than 1 hour, you had to ask for help. The product owner sat amongst everybody and was always there to answer questions. As the new features were being developed, they were being demoed to the product owner throughout the day, and we were getting feedback throughout the day. The code got merged to the main branch after demoing it to the product owner. If the team came across any design issues in the code, refactoring was done first before moving on with the feature development. Refactoring was part of the daily development process. The team didn't write any development code without writing tests for it first. The outcome was a lot of value for the business with minimal bugs in both of these two experiences I described. Here are some of the lessons learned from those experiences that I've had. And I have listed the good lessons because if you follow them, if you follow them, these are good lessons. If you don't follow them, those are the bad practices. And there could be more, but I just tried to create a list that I could think about. Support your team. Focus on software design. I like the third one a lot. Don't be dogmatic about the process. Follow the values. Don't just follow the format. Hire right. I think this is really important. And I had this personal experience in 2 places. One, where I and Jason worked together. The reason I grew so much in that role was because lead was a true mentor. He focused on making sure that the developers were growing and enjoying the work. And the team, the first example that I gave, there was one developer struggling a lot with a feature. And the architect was angry. And I said, maybe you should help him. And he said, but I'm the architect. I don't have time to help people. So, anyway, encourage learning and provide resources to learn. Enable face-to-face communication. Bring the business experts to the center of the design. Trust your team. Work towards building self-organizing teams. Make sure that your Scrum Master is the coach of the process and the values behind the process, and not only after the delivery. Make sure that the business analysts, product owners, or domain experts, whatever you call them, are part of the development team, and they're always accessible. Developers should work through the requirements focused on the business values and not technical requirements. Now, this last point, I was attending this workshop, an architectural workshop, and one of the architects said, yes, he talks with the business, and then he comes back and creates technical requirements for the developers. And so it happens more than often. Now, I tried to create a short list of values that I thought could summarize all these things. And I came up with focus on good design, focus on building close relationship between the developers and the business, make sure the development is iterative, that the delivery is iterative, and foster communication. And in the end, focus on design and follow the values, not just the process. Thank you. And I didn't put these spiders on my laptop. My son did. He wanted to decorate it.
We have a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions, raise your hand and I'll bring a mic around.
Yeah, I didn't think there would be any questions. But I can answer from the experience I've had.
Congratulations for your talk. It was very well done, first of all. The point that I wanted to bring up was you emphasized a lot on the role of the Scrum Masters. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you, but for different reasons, of course. And I personally believe that most of the time, the role of the Scrum Master is the most misunderstood one. As you said, majority of the time, it's a project manager that, with a tap of the shoulder and a little certificate, all of a sudden they feel like, they have a different title, but they end up doing exactly the same thing.
Yep.
Whereas in most of these organizations, the part that is completely failing is trying to articulate the fact that the Scrum Master is a facilitator more than anything else. And that part by itself should be part of all that certification courses and everything, which is not at the moment. Nobody actually really teaches that. And that, of course, brings up the frustrations that you actually were alluding to a few times, actually, in your talk. So I wanted to just bring that up, and of course, thank you for mentioning that.
So when I worked at Microsoft, it was the first team I came across that followed the Agile process. And we had Scrum Master. It was a rotating role. One person became Scrum Master for that duration of the sprint. And the role was supposed to eventually disappear. Once you become a self-organizing team, the role goes away. And that's how the Scrum Alliance talks about this role too. It's not a role that is ever present in a team. It's to help the development team to become self-organizing so that you don't need anybody else to help you.
Thank you, Gomti. Can we have one more round of applause for Gomti?
Thank you.